In a small, overlooked courtroom tucked behind Wheeler's administrative offices, an old man sat in silence. The room smelled faintly of dust and old varnish. The clock above the judge's bench ticked without urgency, and the few attendees in the gallery, clerks, an off-duty bailiff, a yawning intern, barely noticed the defendant in the chair nearest the bench. Henry Lowell, age 76, sat shackled at the wrists. The chain rattled faintly every time he adjusted his position, though his movements were slow and deliberate, not from restraint but fatigue. His shoulders sloped from years of labor, and his skin bore the faded tone of someone who had spent a lifetime beneath harsh sun and biting wind. His gray hair was uncombed, and a small cut near his temple had darkened into a bruise that stretched to the ridge of his cheekbone. A dried streak of blood marked his collar, but no one had offered him a cloth, and no one seemed particularly bothered by its presence. The room itself seemed indifferent to him. The benches were half empty, and the public defender assigned to him had not shown. No excuse had been offered for their absence. The prosecutor, a young man with a pressed suit and a habit of glancing at his watch, shuffled paperwork, clearly more preoccupied with his afternoon meeting than the case before him. The judge leafed through the docket with mechanical precision, eyes skimming lines without seeming to read. Henry's case was number 17 on the day's calendar, officially listed as disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, assault on a security official. No context, no history, no mention of the place or the people involved. Just charges and a much asterisk tea taken at dawn, where the old man's eyes looked glassy and stunned, not from guilt but from exhaustion. There was no one in the gallery who came to see him. No friend from the shelter where he had volunteered. No neighbor. No family. He had been arrested 2 nights before, held in a cold cell with a broken cot and flickering overhead light, and now he sat without representation, waiting to be processed like a misplaced file in an overburdened system. Outside, a thin veil of snow had begun to fall, covering the sidewalks in silence. Inside, the heater clanged to life in fits, pushing warmth through rusted vents, unable to soften the chill of the institutional air. Henry breathed slowly, his hands resting in his lap, the cuffs cutting lightly into his skin. He didn't plead. He didn't look up. He didn't seem surprised. He had known this day would come. Not because of guilt, but because the world often failed to understand those who acted on principle rather than policy. Especially when they were old, invisible, and inconvenient. He had stepped in where others would not. And the system had answered, not with questions, but with procedure. The judge adjusted his glasses, tapped the gavel once out of habit more than necessity, and glanced toward the defense table. No one had spoken yet. The defender's seat remained empty. The prosecutor cleared his throat, ready to proceed regardless. Time, after all, was a limited commodity in Wheeler County, and few wanted to waste it on the unknown sins of an old man in tattered clothes. Then the courtroom doors creaked open. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the room like a gust of wind in still air. Heads turned, not in alarm, but in mild curiosity. The bailiff straightened from his post. The judge's gaze lifted slowly. A man had entered. He wore a sharply pressed military uniform, the kind that required hours of care and attention. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His chest bore rows of ribbons and service medals, each one earned in places most people in that room had never heard of. His posture was erect, his face unreadable, and his steps echoed with quiet authority as he moved past the benches and down the aisle without hesitation. He carried a folder under one arm, thick with paper and sealed with a crest only a few would recognize. But it was not the folder that commanded attention, it was the man himself. Something about his presence filled the room with a sudden stillness, as if all the air had paused. Without breaking stride, he moved to the defense table and stopped beside Henry Lowell. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence said everything that words could not. The prosecutor hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. The judge sat forward in his seat, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Something in his face shifted, not quite recognition, but the faintest tremor of respect. The uniformed man placed the folder on the table in front of Henry and rested one hand gently on the old man's shoulder. The gesture was quiet, steady, without drama, but it changed the shape of the moment entirely. For the first time since the proceedings had big asterisk N, the room listened. The gavel was never struck. The docket was set aside. The silence that followed was not empty, it was expectant. Every person in that room, from the board clerk to the distracted intern, sensed that something had changed. They didn't know the details, not yet, but they could feel the weight of what was coming. The man in uniform did not introduce himself. He didn't offer his name or rank. He didn't need to. What mattered was that he had come. And that Henry Lowell, invisible just moments before, was no longer alone. The courtroom still hadn't moved. After years of disregard and silence, Henry Lowell had become a figure once again noticed, though not yet understood. As the man in uniform took his seat beside him, people began to wonder who he truly was. The quiet dignity of his composure no longer read as resignation. It began to look like patience. In the hours that followed, as recess was quietly declared and the docket reshuffled, Henry remained still. The man beside him, Colonel Eli Mercer, spoke briefly with the court clerk, his voice low but direct. He produced credentials and documents sealed with military insignia. One of the pages bore a photograph, faded at the edges but unmistakably clear in its subject, a younger Henry Lowell in camouflage fatigues, standing at the edge of a dense jungle with his hand resting on the shoulder of another soldier. That other soldier was Mercer himself, nearly 30 years younger, wounded and soot-streaked, with one boot missing and a bandage around his ribs. Behind them, the remnants of an outpost smoldered under the twilight sky. Before that photograph had been taken, there had been fire, smoke, and a desperate evacuation. Henry, then the commanding sergeant of a specialized unit stationed near the Panama Canal, had carried Mercer through a collapsing ammunition depot. Others had run. Henry had stayed, even when the radio signal warned of incoming artillery. He had said nothing, only gritted his teeth and moved, dragging Mercer through ash and debris, shielding him with his own body. That act alone had saved Mercer's life. But Henry Lowell had never spoken of that day, not in interviews, not in veteran circles, not even in moments of weakness. Recognition had never been the goal. Quiet duty had always been enough. After the war, Henry had returned to Montana, the only place that still resembled home. He and his wife, Grace, had purchased a small home near the hills, a modest place filled with books and framed photographs. Grace had been a teacher for the hearing impaired, fluent in sign language, a woman of fierce empathy and gentle conviction. Through her, Henry had learned to sign, not for necessity, but for love. They had no children of their own. Grace's illness came too early. By the time her diagnosis was confirmed, there was little that could be done. Henry had held her hand through every stage, through every hospital visit and each quiet decline. She passed one autumn morning with a book on her chest and the light streaming in through the east window. After she was gone, Henry filled his days not with grief but with service. He began volunteering at a youth shelter across town, one that quietly housed children with behavioral and neurological conditions. Many had been abandoned. Others arrived through back channels, foster systems, emergency placements, the occasional late-night drop-off with no name and no backstory. Henry worked without fanfare. He fixed leaky sinks. He repainted walls. He sat on the porch during stormy nights, keeping anxious children company until sleep returned. He learned every child's name, their habits, their signs of distress. He never raised his voice. He never left early. Among those children was a teenage girl named Mari. She was 14, profoundly deaf, and lived with autism spectrum disorder. Communication had always been difficult, but with Henry, she flourished. Grace's teachings, passed on through silent hand movements and careful patience, allowed them to speak in a language all their own. It was Mari who had been at the center of the incident that led to Henry's arrest. That night, just after sunset, she had wandered outside the shelter's attached laundry facility. Curfew rules were strict, not out of cruelty, but out of structure. A security guard had spotted her and reacted harshly. Perhaps he didn't know her condition. Perhaps he did and simply didn't care. Either way, his grip on her arm was too tight, and her panic was immediate. Henry had been nearby, folding linens in the back. He heard the commotion and recognized Mari's cry, not audible, but visual. Her hands flailed not in aggression, but in fear. Her eyes darted for help. Without hesitation, Henry stepped between them. He didn't shout. He didn't shove. He used sign language, calm and measured, the way Grace had taught him. He signed the word for safe. Then calm. Then help. The guard, young and untrained, misunderstood the scene. Maybe he saw an old man interfering. Maybe he felt embarrassed. He called the police. They arrived fast. 2 cars. Flashing lights. No questions. They saw a struggle, heard a warning from the guard, and assumed the rest. Henry had only time to raise his hands before he was struck from behind, thrown to the pavement. His shoulder cracked on the curb. Tasers were drawn. A brief report was filed, and a confused teenager was led away by a staff member while her protector was taken in handcuffs. At the precinct, Henry said little. He gave his name, his address, and waited. No one asked what had happened. No one asked why a man of his age and condition would interfere unless there was cause. The charges came swiftly. The headline the next morning read, "Transient arrested after disturbance at youth shelter." His mugshot *T was grainy and cruel, taken under the same flickering light that had kept him awake the night before. It didn't matter that he had worn the uniform with honor. It didn't matter that he had saved lives or buried a wife with dignity or spoken in the quietest language known to love. To them, he was just another old man with a bruise and a record. And yet now, with Mercer beside him, the narrative was shifting. A thread was being pulled from a much larger story. In that courtroom, where once there had been apathy, there was now something else. Attention. Recognition. A beginning. 3 days later, when the court reconvened, the room was full. They came in quiet pairs, some in uniform, others in worn jackets with service pins discreetly fastened to lapels. Veterans, shelter workers, local journalists, and neighbors who had once passed Henry on the sidewalk without seeing him. Even the bailiff stood taller, somehow more alert, as though he sensed the importance of the moment. Henry entered not alone this time, but with Colonel Mercer beside him. His clothes were clean, pressed. The bruises had faded, but a small bandage still sat near his temple. In his hands, he carried nothing. No speech, no prepared testimony. Just the calm he had always worn like a second skin. The judge looked different too. The gavel was untouched on his bench, his eyes trained on the man before him. In the space where routine had once dictated rhythm, there was now care. Evidence was presented. Footage from the shelter's security camera played in slow silence. There, frozen in frames, Henry could be seen approaching with open palms, signing words of reassurance. Mari's face, panicked and tear-streaked, transformed in those seconds, not because of restraint, but because she had recognized him. Trusted him. The footage showed the guard's reaction, defensive and impulsive. Then the arrival of officers. The speed of escalation. Henry's fall. His hands raised even as his body hit the ground. Then came the testimony. Colonel Mercer, voice steady, told the court not just about the fire in Panama, but about the man who had carried wounded soldiers through fire without waiting for orders. About the man who taught young recruits discipline through kindness. About the man who never sought promotions, only purpose. The girl was not there, too shy, too scared of crowds, but a social worker read her written statement. In it, she described Henry's quiet presence at the shelter, how he made her feel seen without making her feel exposed. At the end of the letter, scrawled in crooked, careful print, were just 2 words, "He listened." Then, unexpectedly, a police officer who had assisted in Henry's arrest asked to speak. His voice cracked as he admitted to misjudgment. He had watched the footage, he said, 3 times. Each time it hurt more. He had not listened. He had not asked. And that failure would stay with him. From the gallery, the mayor of a neighboring town stepped forward next. He had heard the story and recognized Henry's name from a different file, an incident report from 7 winters ago, when a stranger had jumped into an icy river to pull a drowning man from the current. That man had been the mayor's brother. The act had never been traced, but now the pieces aligned. The mayor submitted a formal statement of gratitude and support. The court was silent as the judge reviewed the material again. Then, slowly, he stood. His voice was quieter than usual, more deliberate. All charges were dismissed with prejudice. He paused, looking directly at Henry. Then, with both hands resting on the bench, he spoke words the room would remember for years. This court owes Mr. Henry Lowell not just an apology, but a correction. The system failed to ask the most important question, why? Today, we answer it with recognition. No applause followed. Just stillness. The kind that comes after something sacred. Later that week, the city council released a statement of its own. Training programs for police and shelter workers were being overhauled. Trauma-informed response modules would be required. Disability awareness protocols were now mandatory. The youth shelter where Henry had volunteered for over a decade was renamed Lowell House. A plaque was mounted near the entrance. It read simply, in honor of quiet protection. Henry refused interviews. When asked by local reporters for comment, he politely declined. He had no interest in becoming a symbol. But change didn't require his permission. He continued his life in quiet service, now officially invited to train new staff at the shelter. He taught classes in nonverbal communication, using Grace's old books and his own still steady hands. He joined a local veterans center, offering peer counseling to those who spoke not with words, but with glances, breath, and silence. His small office bore no trophies. No medals. Just a folded flag on the shelf, a worn photo of Grace, and a single card, handwritten in crooked letters. Thank you for staying. 6 months after his arrest, Henry's presence had reshaped policy across 3 counties. Shelter protocols had changed. Arrest procedures were reevaluated. Officers now asked different questions. And those once too afraid to speak found a kind of courage in his story. Colonel Mercer visited once a month, bringing cadets to observe. He never spoke long, only introduced Henry with a nod and let the silence speak for itself. In the end, Henry never sought acknowledgement. He never asked to be defended, only to be understood. And as the seasons changed and the snow gave way to spring, people in Wheeler began to understand that kindness didn't need cameras or applause. It only needed someone willing to stand still when others ran. Someone who listened. Someone like Henry. And so the simple truth remained. Kindness without question is enough.